So we're delighted to have everybody here, and we're about to start the panel on monies in the state in an age of empire. And our moderator for this panel is going to be Stephen Ike. So Stephen is Stephen's research is in political theory and the history of political thought, in particular in the political theory of money and financial capitalism. He's currently the Perkins Coates and Postdoctoral Fellow in Princeton, and he holds a PhD in political science from Yale, a master's in political thought and intellectual history from the University of Cambridge, in a BA in philosophy, politics, and economics from the University of Oxford. So we're looking forward to that.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to introduce the speakers very briefly, and then they have around 15 minutes each. And I think then actually we're going to turn it straight over to you and ask questions. And I'm going to just insert my questions where they fit. But rather than taking up more time than necessary, you really should have an hour of Q&A. So just to introduce the speakers very briefly. To my right is E. George Galway, who's from Harvard University, presenting a paper entitled From Distribution to the Protection of Private Property, The Politics of Money and Credit in the Early United States. Next to her, Andrew Edwards from the University of Oxford, presenting on Money to Burn, Money to Spend, a tale of two monies at the beginning of the American Revolution. Then next to Andrew, Elizabeth Cross from Georgetown University, presenting on the French East India Company and the monetary politics of the French Revolution. And finally, at the end, James Livesey from the University of Dundee, presenting on local debt for local people, debt in the Languedoc, 1750 to 1789. Do you have any preferences in terms of order? Otherwise, I would suggest we just go through this way.
Published order.
Let's stick to the published order and return from where I just introduced them. And we begin with James, then move on to Andrew, then Elizabeth, and then George.
Okay, thank you very much. And like everybody else, I think we'd like to thank the organisers for all the work they've put in gathering this enormous number of people who are interested in money and the democratic order. So I'm kicking off, and what I thought I'd ask be the question was, why would you care? Most of you people not being historians, apart from this crowd over here, why would you care about imperial money and the question of money and empire in the 18th century if you didn't care about the 18th century, right? If you weren't already committed to being an historian, what would go on? What's going on here? And what I want to suggest is that when we look at that 18th century moment, what we're looking at a moment of distributed sovereignty, that the question of empire when we're looking at it at the purposes for money, it's not so much interested as the externality, at what empire does to other people, right? Rather, empire gets interesting on the inside, because all empires are massively differentiated. And therefore, that notion of distributed sovereignty... Speak into the mic. Okay. I find that very hard, but anyway, I will try. In distributed sovereignty, different kinds of money are being emanated at different levels of the empire. There may be a story about sovereignty and a story about value held at the imperial center, but that is not experienced at the imperial meridian or even at the intermediary sections of the empire. And in the 15 minutes that we have to speak within, which we should, I am going to make matters worse by squeezing in 2, not 1 papers. And I'm going to talk very quickly about Berkeley to give you some sense of the intellectual history of imperial money in the 18th century, and then talk about the Languedoc, which is a much more rich example. So the story is rooted in intellectual history, and what it wants to speak to, what it wants to pick up, is the observation that's made by lots of people that we live with a folk story about the transition from barter to spontaneous money. And most people, if you look at David Graeber, or if you look at Chris's book, they locate Adam Smith as absolutely at the center of who disseminates that story. Where does the notion that money is a valueless intermediary for actions of spontaneous individuals, that the money itself carries no cogency. Where does that story come from? And they locate Smith. And if you do the intellectual history of where Smith gets this idea, if you read Dougal Stewart's 1791 biography, Stewart identifies Berkeley, the Irish philosopher, and his querist of 1735 as the key source. All right? And that's really interesting because, of course, Berkeley is one of the first theorists to explicitly endorse a notion of money as purely conventional, right? Not rooted in specie, not rooted in an asset, but purely an ideational form that represents what he called the industry, i.e. the value, the future production of a community. What people don't realize is that the source that Smith gets this story from, that 1750 version of the querist, is a highly edited version of the 1737 edition. And the 1737 edition was presented to the Irish Parliament as a plan for a central bank. And to speak precisely to the topic of the conference, it was the Irish Parliament which should constitute itself as a central bank, but only a reformed Irish Parliament. Thus, sovereignty and money were absolutely mapped directly onto one another. And you ask, now, where did Berkeley come up with this amazing idea? Of course, where he got it from was America. Between 1728 and 1732, Berkeley was in Rhode Island, sitting waiting for the money for his plan to establish a proper university in the colonies, as they then were. He gave the money to Harvard and Yale when it didn't turn up. Waiting for that to head up, himself and his wife. And his wife, Anne Berkeley, was the daughter of John Foster, who had founded the Irish National Debt in 1716. So basically, Berkeley's querist in 1735 is a theorization of what he'd observed in the American colonies, which, as we know, were a space of enormous financial experimentation. Since, and we're going to have a lot of discussion about this, there were all sorts of needs that had to be met, economic needs of exchange, that various colonies and various groups met in various ways. What Berkeley did, and he writes the Alciphron in 1732 while he's thinking about money, is he recognizes that the variability of the forms of money that he observes must mean that money has no essential referent, therefore can be purely conventional and can be an act of pure political will. Right? So the querist, which is an enormously difficult text, it's a deeply postmodern text, it's set up as a series of questions rather than as a series of sentences. And you're led to work out what the querist actually means through the act of reading. It's an enormous, Berkeley, who believes in the centrality of mind to everything, he's got this, it's a wonderful way in which a philosopher actually makes his method and his source work together. So it's a difficult text. But the querist theorizes one aspect of the experience of the British Empire. But what it illustrates, and I'm going to move to the Languedoc, what it illustrates is that in that moment between the financial revolution, somewhere in the late 17th century, and the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which stabilizes the global financial situation and sets up the order-producing rules, which will then create international finance as we know it, in that moment, the space of experimentation is enormously wide. I've spoken of one experiment, that Berkeley's querist, which of course sadly remains an intellectual experiment. The Irish Parliament completely rejects this proposition in 1737 on the grounds, and this is the interesting thing, on the grounds that they felt that any central bank set up in Ireland would be vulnerable to rent-seeking on the part of the British Parliament, and that to centralise Irish fiscality would literally make it vulnerable to imperial extraction. So you wouldn't do that. You would restrict yourself to informal means of capitalizing the economy. So that's itself interesting. And I want to talk a little about the Languedoc. So, if Berkeley's is a story of innovation, the experience of the Languedoc between 1750 and 1789 is one of what might be called radical orthodoxy. The institutions that are used in order to establish public credit and to fiscalize the economy of the province are historic, are ancient. Right? It's a pied d'etat, which means that it has a right to impose its own collection of taxes, though of course it is the king who authorizes that. So the Sovereign Act happens in Paris, but then the governance acts all happen in the Languedoc. Between 1750 and 1789, as the fiscal needs of the French monarchy develop, more and more of the governance of the country is pushed back onto the level of the pied d'etat. They do more and more of that work. Just to give you one example, one of the reasons that the roads in the Languedoc are so good, in fact Arthur Young, when he does his tour there in 1787, remarks that they're too good, they spent too much money on them, is because the Languedoc is running its own engineering corps, entirely separate from the Corps of Engineers, and developing its own road system. So if you're looking at state and state-like functions, the province is stepping in for more and more of those. Between 1750 and 1789, the French monarchy can only borrow money at 10%. The estates of the Languedoc are borrowing at 4%. Thus, the estates of the Languedoc borrow for the monarchy, right, and then manage the debt itself. The society is sophisticated enough that it can understand that the exposure to the estates is massively less than the exposure to the monarchy. That is because it's nested within this deeply systematic hybrid system which links up political representation with fiscality. And frankly, you're going to have to buy my book, which is coming out with Yale next August, to get this. In 15 minutes, I could not go through the complexity of the system, but there are 4 different subsidiary levels of taxation and of governance action: the estate, the sénéchaussée, the diocese, and the parish. All of them are establishing public credit. All of them are doing public works. All of them have development strategies. And they're all congruent with one another. And this relies then on a political community which is capable of spontaneously coordinating with itself within that fiscal political structure in order to establish rational outcomes. And if one was doing the economic history, then one would look at the relationship between public investment in the Languedoc and economic performance, and what you'd see is that productivity goes up by about 2% per annum between 1750 and 1789, and you get the more rational allocation of assets, thus in half of the province, not the lower half, in the upper half, in the upper Languedoc, the areas which had been gone over to subsistence farming, largely wheat, are now put under vines, mass-producing vines for mass consumption back up in northern France. So what you're getting is the use of markets by farmers and by peasant families as a rational strategy for their own sustenance and well-being, but that's linked into a public strategy, linked into a provincial strategy. I'll keep it to my time. Somebody would ask, well, God, if the old regime was so rational, how in God's name did the revolution happen in 1789? Wow, right? Sovereignty. If you have a revolution in 1789, which is against privilege, and you have a critique of the provinces and of the ancien regime, you raise the spectre that all of the sovereign debt of the Languedoc could be turned into privileged debt and thus non-state. Thus, the province effectively liquidates itself in 1790 in order to make sure that its debts could be repaid. The system of governance worked, but as soon as you had a new model of national sovereignty, which went against the distributed sovereignty, which had underpinned the debt, that meant in order to save the debt, to save the capital, the province had to go. Okay, thank you.
See if I can get this to work. I'm using 2 different computers at the same time to present this presentation, so I apologize in advance for how that does or does not work. Oh, okay. Oh.
So far, so good.
Good. Hi. Yeah, so the paper I'm presenting today is entitled A Tale of Two Monies, Britain and France, North America, 1775 to 1776. It's a comparative analysis of two monies as a single moment in the history of the British Empire. The first was British, called upon in the House of Commons on April 24th, 1776. Prime Minister Lord North told Parliament that in order to, quote, exert that strength which when properly exerted never failed to prevail, British military might, Parliament needed to borrow £2 million sterling at 3% interest. North got the loan, and by the end of the year, Parliament had raised £1.94 million. The second money was American. Over the course of the year prior to North's speech, Britain's North American colonies had created monies for war. Beginning within the weeks of the clashes at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, the colonies created a variety of paper monies in order to fend off Britain's impending invasion. On the surface, these two monies, loosely construed, had much in common. Both, after all, were attempts to finance war emerging from the British monetary tradition. However, if we consider the internal design of the monies involved, focusing on the way the laws constitute monies as processes rather than simply arranging or procuring them, one profound difference emerges. In Great Britain, money was a permanent form of wealth. In conventional terms, a store of value. Saved, borrowed, spent, and re-spent, but never extinguished. American monies were not. They were literally monies to burn, money with an expiration date, a feature with significant implications for the way that American society, in contrast to that of the British, produced and reproduced monetary wealth. As we will see, the underlying difference between American and British monies had societal implications as well. The British monetary system produced semi-permanent monetary capital and a permanent moneyed class of legal owners to command it, capitalists, if you will, that would dominate financial and industrial capitalism as it emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries. No analog yet existed in the American system. The wealth embodied for a term in America's paper monies was extinguished with it. Burning erased it. American money could not be, and in fact was not, the basis for a permanent moneyed class yet. Clarifying the distinction between the British and American monies in 1775 and 1776 requires seeing the two monies as their British and American designers seem to have intended, as forms of wealth with a distinct relationship to time, or in other words, as modes of governance linking pre-existing forms of wealth with an imagined future. We will explore this distinction in 3 steps. First, we will examine the internal design of the first revolutionary monies, with a particular reference to the colonies' emphasis on making them temporary by burning them. Second, we will examine the internal design of British monies raised at the same time via parliamentary action. And finally, we will compare the two. So first, money to burn. And I have to use this computer for that. Money to burn. All right. So perhaps the strangest thing about America's revolutionary money is all the burning. For example, in July 1775, the act establishing Virginia's first bills of credit of the Revolutionary era appointed 10 men as a committee to superintend the burning of said notes to be taxed out of existence by the ordinances of the Virginia Convention. New Jersey, in February 1776, ordinance authorizing 50,000 pounds of proclamation money worth of bills of credit established taxes so that they would be, quote, burnt and destroyed. On July 6, 1775, New Hampshire's 4th Provincial Congress ordered that its notes, quote, when redeemed shall be consumed to ashes in the presence of the representatives of the colony. Pennsylvania's assembly passed a tax, quote, on all estates and real and personal on June 30, 1775, to make more certain paying, redeeming, discharging, and sinking the said bills of credit. On September 29th of the same year, the Pennsylvania Committee on the State of Public Accounts reported it had, quote, inspected and examined the several public accounts mentioned in the report and have burnt, sunk, and destroyed the different parcels of bills of credit as mentioned and specified in the same. Treasurer Owen Jones' summary explained the colony in that year had burnt and destroyed, quote, 24,113 pounds, 17 shillings, and 11 pence of, quote, the paper bills. So it is clear from the context that the phrase sunk, burnt, and destroyed did not refer to 3 different operations, but one, and that is the destruction of the currencies that the provincial legislatures had produced. The process was not limited to a specific region or colonial tradition in 1775. Most colony laws mentioned burning explicitly, and colonies that did not mention burning immediately pledged to sink or destroy their bills just the same. In case you were wondering, the internal design of the continental dollar followed that of the United Colonies. So on Thursday, June 22nd, 1775, the Continental Congress authorized a sum not exceeding 2 millions of Spanish milled dollars, printed in denominations of 1 to 20 on 403,800 paper bills. A little over a month later, on Saturday, July 29th, 1775, having bumped the first run by $1 million, Congress laid down the rules intended to sink the continental currency. So the term sink, again, referred to that same process of burnt, sunk, and destroyed. Congress meant the bills to be annihilated, not, as some historians still argued, to be paid off in silver. In order to be clear, Congress passed a tax on the same day, equivalent to the entire print run. So bills received in taxes, according to the law, would be holed with a one-hole punch, sent to the continental treasurers, with a committee of 5 men appointed for the purpose, would first, quote, examine and count the continental bills, and then in the presence of the said committee, burn and destroy them. Colonies enabled to send bills would send gold and silver if they had it, but the specie was not to spend. The treasurers would keep hold of the specie until, quote, demanded in redemption for continental bills, after which, quote, bills so redeemed, they shall also burn and destroy in the presence of the said committee. This was considered unlikely given the general scarcity of gold and silver. The point was that all of the bills of credit would be consumed. So the implications for an American money as a process existing in time then start to become clear. The colonies created money. They did so in part because they had little monetary wealth to begin with, either to borrow or tax. But more importantly, they intended to keep it that way. The monies were designed to self-destruct, in order, by implication, to preserve a society where cash and money capital of any kind was scarce, and other non-moneyed forms of property, which is a core part of an 18th century man's personality, identity, and power, dominated. In other words, if we consider the bills of credit created by the Continental Congress and colonial assemblies as a process existing in time, it becomes clear that in the future envisioned in these acts of money creation, when all the taxes were paid and the bills destroyed, the assemblies expected something like the status quo antebellum, a society with little pecuniary wealth but plenty of land, people, and property, where lawyers, yeoman farmers, and slave-holding planter merchants, like the founders themselves, reigned supreme. If we take that view, it becomes clear that the burning was as an integral part of colonial money as the paper it was printed on. The end result of all the printing, taxing, and burning would be an empty treasury, an unencumbered populace, and hopefully victory. No doubt legislatures would make more money, but no one over the course of the medium term would be able to accumulate it or capitalize it, a fact with distinct implications for America's position in the 18th century world of mercantile capitalism. America's paper money were temporary means to temporary ends. In other words, they were quite the opposite of the money being gathered just then across the Atlantic. Money to spend and respend. So if we turn to Lord North's speech from April 24, 1776, requesting money for war in America, it is immediately clear that we're on different financial ground. As a financial matter, Great Britain did not make money to pay for its wars. It borrowed money. And by money, it meant either gold and silver or credible claims for gold and silver. The notion that British money was in fact precious metal outside of the control of the state was obviously an ideological position, but that prejudice was real, and its consequences for the internal design of British money were significant. In 1776, when Parliament needed to spend, it felt the need to find new ways to coax investors to give it the paper and metal monies it desired in return for compensation. The implication was that monetary wealth pre-existed outside of the state's demands and needed to be coaxed back in. Doing so required striking a bargain with those who had money and might be willing to invest. Funding the war, North argued, meant navigating between two aims: to make the best bargain he could for the public, and, quote, to give a stockholder a reasonable profit and encouragement to subscribe. It also entailed offering variety. So for every £100 invested, investors would receive two things. First, they would get, for every first £70, each investor would get 3% annuities worth £77.5.
A top-up Lord North justified as reflecting, quote, the fair market price of the stock subject to redemption at the will of Parliament. The next £30, on the other hand, would be turned into 3 lottery tickets. The £600,000 from these tickets would be distributed into prizes, convertible as well into 3% annuities. The interest on these annuities would be paid by new taxes on wheeled carriages, stage coaches, along with stamp duties on playing cards, dice, newsprint, and indentures. North had apparently heard rumors in London that there was not enough gold and silver in Britain to meet the financial demands such taxing, borrowing, and spending required. This complaint, he argued, was unjustified. The country was teeming with gold and silver, not much short of 20 million pounds, he guessed, and plenty, he argued, to meet any demand. North's point was that Britain's pre-existing monetary wealth would suffice to meet any needs the exchequer put upon it until America's loyalty was restored. In return for the wealth, the government offered securities that themselves were money-like. The assets were divisible, transferable, perpetual. Every contributor could assign them to their executors, their successors, and everyone was entitled to 3% interest payable twice yearly at the Bank of England until the government returned the principal investment, placing the investor's cash once again outside the state. So viewed as a process existing in time, it is clear that Britain's money, unlike North Americans, represented a permanent form of financial wealth. The structure required pre-existing monetary wealth, both to borrow and tax. It capitalized that wealth to create financial securities that were designed to supply a perpetual monetary income, a moneyed equivalent to a noble estate, and valued on the same terms. These securities were callable, but only in return for the principal invested, returning pre-existing monetary wealth to investors where it might be capitalized again. There was no burning. British money was supposed to last forever. Paper claims for gold and silver and even coins themselves might be worn out, exchanged, or destroyed by the passage of time, but the wealth itself would not. So now let's put the two forms of war funding and money at play in 1775, 1776 side by side. On the one side of the Atlantic, we have seen that American money was temporary, destined to burn. Taxes canceled the bills of credit, destroying their monetary value, but also removing the lien on properties the bills and the taxes to sink them represented, a fact celebrated in the bill's destruction. And on the other, we have seen that Britain's monies were permanent. They were monies that acted like gold and silver, even if they were not. What Karl Polanyi famously called a fictitious commodity, or what Marx called money existing as a commodity relation. The differences between these two operations for the societies orchestrating them were profound. As a process, American money was designed to self-destruct. In contrast, British money reproduced stores of pre-existing money perpetually. If we use John Levy's definition of capital as, quote, a legal asset assigned a pecuniary value in expectation of its capacity to yield a likely future pecuniary income, and capitalists, the moneyed interests that own them, this actually produces a form of capitalism. The implications of this difference for our understanding of the American Revolution and its consequences, again, are profound. The difference suggests that the market revolution and the expansion of moneyed capital and the American transition to capitalism after the revolution may be tied to a crucial decision regarding American money. Americans, after ratifying the Constitution, stopped burning it. The American market revolution, in this sense, can be understood as the beginning of a transition from a system in which money was burned regularly and routinely to one where burning it is seen as a revolutionary, wasteful, or simply antisocial act. More broadly, it strongly suggests that industrial and financial capitalism, as developed in the global system of the 19th and 20th centuries, required a permanent money as the, quote, sound basis for modern wealth. Finally, in terms of money as a democratic medium, it suggests that changing money might change the world. Thank you.
Next we have Elizabeth Cross.
Hello. I will try to speak into the microphone as much as possible. I'd just like to reiterate everybody's thanks to the organizers and also to Jim himself for bringing this panel together. I think it's a really great opportunity. So basically my paper today is going to tell the story of a scandal that took place at one of these moments of monetary transition in the French Revolution, and accordingly it is a story that shows how monetary politics can be extremely deadly. So on April 5th, 1794, when the famous revolutionary Georges Danton was carted off to the guillotine, he did not go alone, because in one of the carts just behind him were 4 other people who weren't accused of political crimes, but of financial ones. These 4 deputies to the National Convention were accused, in all probability correctly, of abusing their offices by taking bribes from the directors of a major financial institution, the Compagnie des Indes, or French East India Company. This affair was the greatest corruption scandal to rock revolutionary France, and when it was uncovered by the government, it was spun into allegations of a vast foreign plot in which corrupt deputies, financiers, and enemy powers allegedly conspired against the Revolutionary Republic. As this plot subsequently formed the judicial basis of the Committee of Public Safety's attack against major political factions like Danton's, those indictments have led most subsequent scholars to focus on whether these people really were guilty and whether this scandal really was part of a counter-revolutionary foreign plot. But I argue that a more productive focus is to read this scandal against the broader troubled revolutionary economic climate in which it took place. Because historians exploring the economic life of the French Revolution have revealed its political and cultural aspects, specifically how the use and ownership of money and property were seen as constructive of sovereignty, citizenship, and identity, like Rebecca Spang's work. As revolutionaries sought to remake France and its financial institutions, they had to reckon with the problem of the old regime's extensive debt, but rather than repudiating it, they created a new means of financing it. The old regime's reliance on loans frequently solicited through the granting of privileges to institutions like the French East India Company had placed a lot of fiscal and constitutional authority in the hands of private financial actors. So as the revolutionaries sought to eliminate these intermediaries, they made their debts repayable with a national paper currency known as the assignat. But as the assignats struggled, institutions like the East India Company became seen not as a method of shoring up state finances as they had been under the old regime, but rather a potent threat to them. Because while this attack against the company had been initiated by corrupt deputies, they appealed to a broader narrative that called for securing the new financial regime by eliminating relics of the old. So although the National Assembly had abolished the trading monopoly of the East India Company in 1790, it continued to trade actively into the French Revolution. But the financial situation of the revolutionary state was far less stable due to the creation of this paper currency, the assignat, a currency backed by seized church and emigre properties. The currency had been a source of public anxiety since its inception, as many correctly feared the assignat's excessive volatility. But it nonetheless became sort of a monetary embodiment of France's new order and its commitment to repay the debts amassed by the monarchy. To accept the credit and value of the assignat was to display one's patriotic revolutionary commitments, and to doubt or challenge it was a counter-revolutionary act. So from the perspective of its advocates, as the principles of the revolution were sound, the causes of the currency's depreciation had to be totally artificial, that is, the result of some sort of financial and political conspiracy. These supposed conspirators had another means of driving down the assignat's value, according to this vision. This was in the form of speculation in the shares of private companies like the East India Company. Because in the late old regime, these anxieties had focused on the trading of bearer instruments known as actions au porteur, shares that were traded quickly and anonymously on paper, providing ample opportunities for fraud. And the revolutionaries increasingly worried that as this speculation continued clandestinely in these high-valued private instruments rather than in assignats, confidence in the revolutionary currency would plummet, giving artificially heightened values to instruments ostensibly worth less than the assignat. So throughout the revolution, lawmakers looked at ways to control and limit these seemingly irresponsible forms of stock trading. And in late 1792, a series of laws were adopted requiring the official registration and taxation of all of these shares. Bearers and their respective financial companies were required to pay to register the ownership of their shares with a public tax collector, which would allow for the taxation of capital gains and imposition of financial transaction taxes to discourage frequent trading. The shareholders of the financial companies demanded accordingly that the administrations of companies like the East India Company act to mitigate or forestall these regulations, which they did through a tax evasion scheme by which the hated bearer instruments were secretly registered on the company's books, thus seemingly evading the taxes imposed by the Assembly. Now, this evasion went unnoticed for months, as the revolutionary assemblies never really attempted to enforce these laws. But by the spring of 1793, the war with Britain and the radicalization of revolutionary discourse raised anxieties about the relationship between financial speculation, currency devaluation, and food shortages to new levels, leading some deputies to revisit these unenforced laws. On July 9th, the deputy Joseph Delaunay d'Angers argued that all of the financial joint stock companies were working for speculators at the behest of Britain. To halt their schemes, he demanded the immediate and rigorous enforcement of the tax laws, which were essential to force institutions like the East India Company to put an end to these speculations. As would eventually become apparent in the course of later investigations, he was speaking on behalf of a cabal of deputies and financiers who were seeking to use their legislative pulpit in order to make a private fortune. The group had numerous ties to famous speculators in the world of the financial companies, including one Jean-Pierre Baron de Batz, a former deputy to the Constituent Assembly turned counter-revolutionary, whose involvement with the cabal later furnished contemporary Jacobins with grounds for arguing that this conspiracy was indeed one wing of a foreign plot destined to undermine the French Revolution. But the cabal largely sought to make their fortunes through a combination of insider trading and extortion. By threatening shareholders with the enforcement of these tax laws, they hoped to drive down the share prices. On their own admission, the maneuvers were intended to scare the bankers, presumably to render the company's share prices ripe for speculation, and to signal to their directors which deputies held financial power within the convention and were thus worthy targets of bribery. This dynamic began to change, though, upon the intervention of one final deputy, whose role in the ensuing events has been fiercely argued over ever since. Fabre d'Églantine, poet, author of the Revolutionary Calendar, and collaborator of the revolutionary Georges Danton, presented a clear counterpoint to this earlier approach when he spoke subsequently to the convention about the East India Company. Because Delaunay and his associates had largely taken a moderate stance against the company, probably because they were planning on profiting from insider trading in its own shares. By contrast, Fabre d'Églantine offered a broad indictment of all commercial associations as counter-revolutionary. It was impossible, he argued, for institutions like the East India Company to remain wealthy and profitable in the midst of revolutionary political events without illegal conduct. And the high share value, in turn, only encouraged more individuals to speculate in the company rather than investing in biens nationaux or keeping their assets in the revolutionary currency, the assignat. So enforcing the tax laws was only ever a half measure. Rather, institutions like the Compagnie des Indes would always foster speculation, and to stop it, the convention had to annihilate them entirely. So whatever the precise nature of his motives, these interventions by Fabre d'Églantine had the effect of both focusing and radicalizing the convention's attack on the East India Company. On August 24th, when the convention decreed the creation of the Grand Livre de la Dette Publique, which was effectively a centralization and consolidation of all of the French state's outstanding legitimate debts, it also decreed the suppression and liquidation of all existing joint stock companies, including the East India Company. So this impending liquidation now largely ended any benefits that the original cabal might have hoped to reap by speculating in its shares. As their later testimony indicated, Delaunay, the Baron de Batz, and the Baron's friend Benoit d'Angers, a former envoy to Britain, a key point later, devised a new plot to profit from the company. In public, they threatened it with a harsh state-directed liquidation, demanding the immediate payment of the unpaid taxes. But in private, the group offered the company's directors a much more generous decree in exchange for personal bribes. As Fabre d'Églantine, the former hardliner, effectively signed off on this agreement, it's generally assumed that his support for it was purchased through the sharing of this cabal's spoils, usually thought to be somewhere in the realm of 500,000 livres tournois in bribes from the company's directors. So the unraveling of this conspiracy and this bribery scandal had far-reaching political consequences in the Parisian politics of the Terror. When one of the conspirators confessed that the financial elites were attempting to corrupt the convention, this was taken as proof of this vast foreign plot to undermine the revolution, masterminded by financiers. And these allegations were painstakingly stoked by some of the members of the original cabal as ways of sort of concealing their own culpability. However, when the committees began to unearth proof of the secret amendments made to these laws, the entire group was arrested and thrown into prison. As all the participants in the affair had cogently argued that speculation itself was a counter-revolutionary plot within Parisian financial circles, the revelation of their own misdeeds now suggested that this same plot reached deep into the heart of the revolutionary government itself. The outcry over the actual legislative fraud of the scandal sort of dissipated as the Jacobin leadership instead marshaled these tenuous connections to foreign bankers and financiers in order to eliminate revolutionary factions deemed a threat to the rule of the Jacobins during the Terror. So as I began the talk, in one of the most heated and controversial episodes of the Terror, the Dantonists were led to the guillotine in part based off of these charges. So now, while it's certainly a lot of fun to speculate about the motives, identities, and ultimate guilt of all of these participants, this is something of a fruitless endeavor because a lot of the original documentation has simply vanished, and all historians of political corruption can readily concede that it's really hard to trace something whose participants intended to leave no actual traces. Similarly, the contemporary Jacobin insistence on all of this being a vast diplomatic foreign plot similarly frustrates modern attempts to mine surviving sources for viable details. So what I would prefer to do is to think about it more in terms of this in comparison with the other European East India companies of the day. Because if we think about that, the scandal begins to appear somewhat less remarkable. Because even as the power of the British East India Company came under increasing attack in the late 18th century, it continued to exercise uncanny skill at buying influence in Parliament. From the French side of things, the scandal also appears similarly banal in light of recent understandings of the Terror as a period of fundamental weakness of central state authority. Moreover, as years of merchant complaints had noted, the company itself was really no stranger to accusations of corruption, having effectively paid for favors under the royal ministry for a very long time. So in a lot of respects, I think what the scandal really shows is that in spite of these self-declared virtuous Jacobin intentions, the revolution inherited a lot of old regime ways of doing business. Associations like the East India Company, whose traditional avenues to influence had been severed, now sought to exercise power in ways that were novel in newly Republican France, but had long been the routine practice of their rivals across the Channel. So, I'd just like to conclude by noting one of the other ways in which I think we can read this scandal as part of being a token of sort of the monetary instability of the revolutionary period. Because one of the other elements of this attack against the East India Company is that it converged with other newly radicalized revolutionary initiatives against old regime property, financial institutions, and debt. Because at the same time as the attack on the company, the convention began to invalidate many other forms of feudal property owning that early revolutionary assemblies had recognized as legitimate. So this change in perceptions of the legitimacy of certain forms of property is really apparent in the case of the East India Company. Because in 1790, when the abolition of its monopoly had taken place, there was nothing legitimate about the idea of ownership of shares in a private company. But this had changed by 1793, when the very institution of a private company had come to be seen as a kind of de facto privilege that needed to be eradicated in the new revolutionary order. Not only had the company found a way to benefit from the revolution without contributing to it, but its very existence furnished ways for bad citizens, foreigners, and speculators to undermine the revolution through the ownership and circulation of privately held shares. These concurrent initiatives demonstrate a broader revolutionary realization that the currency that one used, and by association, the assets and property that one owned, were constructive of citizenship. Revolutionaries did not seek to make property communal, but to make the ownership of property a communal national experience. The shared usage of currency, like the assignat, and the common purchase of the seized biens nationaux, fostered, in Rebecca Spang's term, a community of believers with a shared faith in the Republic and the Revolution. For this reason, another significant charge against these venal deputies at their trial was the fact that some of them had supposedly received their bribes in company shares, foreign bills of exchange, or worst of all, pounds sterling. This charge was used to illustrate how these co-conspirators had put themselves outside of the revolutionary community by denying the value of the assignat. This problem was not only an ideological one, but rather perceived as materially necessary to secure France's new financial order. Institutions like the Compagnie des Indes, created to shore up public credit in the old regime, were seen as undesirable, problematic, and illegitimate under the new. The suppression of the company may have been accelerated thanks to the venal intrigues of certain deputies, but it very much fit a Jacobin narrative and a Jacobin attempt to force the conversion of private assets into the billets nationaux that alone benefited the revolutionary state. Old regime officials had understood institutions like the East India Company as a necessary component of state financing, as granting privileges to certain bodies in order to secure loans for the monarchy from financial elites was a long-standing practice of the old regime. The end of the East India Company represented a final revolutionary attempt to repudiate this idea. For this reason, in a memorable if succinct denunciation, one of the co-conspirators announced before the National Convention that the Compagnie des Indes' greatest crime was, quote, that its name recalls the old regime. Thank you.
Thank you. George is next.
Thank you. Okay, so there is a deep and enduring quarrel in the American political tradition going back before the revolution over the politics of money creation and debt management, and that's probably not a surprise to you. The use of credit currency by the American colonies and later by the Continental Congress has often been regarded as only a prelude to the establishment of proper modern institutions of public finance, including a funded national debt and a national bank, which came after the establishment of independence. Though the management of public credit and public finance are undoubtedly connected to the issues of nation-state formation, their attribution to the period of the American Revolution is, I'm going to argue, sort of conceptually misplaced or misleading. Instead, the approach I take here suggests that debate over the theory of money as credit currency and its practical application during the American Revolution should be viewed through the lens of empire, and specifically a provincial republican lens. So in this respect, I'm sort of thinking about the range of influences, or the intellectual history really, of colonial American currency and how those were sort of passed on during the American Revolution. And by provincial republican sort of intellectual history, I'm sort of thinking about the relationship of the history of ideas on money and its circulation to reflections on how self-government in colonial or provincial settings could be secured through strategies of self-sufficiency, improvement and invention. And so the point which has been made most persuasively by Christine Dessan is that money as an aspect of early American political economy was very much an aspect of constitutional politics. And I think this is sort of no better illustrated in the sort of constant use of the language of the body politic to talk about money in colonial American political economy. So, as I said, I'm interested in the range of sort of ideological expressions and influences which helped construct the political discourse on money and public credit in 18th century America. And the sort of aim of the paper is to show the way in which political economy, the political economy of money, was removed from the conception of constitutional politics in the late 1780s. So the early American approach towards the politics of money was genuinely innovatory, supporting a democratic, distributionary, and expansionary theory of credit currency at the local level, remedying the scarcity of coin experienced by the colonies as a result of their status within the British Empire. Early American political discourse was oriented towards a theory of the distribution of money in ways which could encourage trade and exchange whilst providing for the public welfare or common good. In their attempts to expand the money supply, early Americans relied upon a conception of sovereignty in combination with a theory of trust, which supported the circulation of public debts to supplement hard money currency. It was the success of these aspects of colonial currency finance which I argue allowed for its ideological extrapolation to a larger revolutionary republican conception of public credit. So modern fiat money first appeared in the American colonies in 1690 as a response to the problem of public indebtedness following a military campaign in Quebec. Through issuing bills of public credit, Massachusetts inaugurated a tradition of supplying credit liquidity created in speculative anticipation of the production of tangible value. These paper bills were backed by the promise, trust, or faith of the community to redeem the circulating bills through future taxation. When Benjamin Franklin described the ancient system of the British Empire, and that's a quote, in which the colonists were, quote, left to govern and tax themselves, he was also referring to the ways in which the colonies had raised enough circulating credit on the basis of mortgaged land or fiat currency to provide for the costs of defence and improvements in commerce and trade. the paper currency schemes or bills of public credit issued by the colonies provided some approximation of the kind of system of forced loans put into practice by mercantile republics and later utilised by leagues of states. Deployed in their attempts to raise the sums necessary to provide for defence, the instruments of credit used by medieval and early modern republics were also tied to their success in trade. And I think the interesting thing about the colonial political economy of money is the sense in which it actually draws on these previous precedents of small states and provincial regimes in the sort of theorization of credit currency. Beginning in 1775, under conditions of war, a system of public credit was mobilized by the Continental Congress as a machine or engine to provide for the exigencies of military expense. And this sort of metaphor of the machine or engine was used quite a few times by Franklin in his description of the continental currency. At the same time, you also see John Adams using the Dutch Revolt, for example, as a sort of important parallel with what the American states were doing in their rebellion against Britain. The continental currency drew very deliberately on the practices or system of fiat currency used by many of the colonies. But the historiography of the American Revolution has been overwhelmingly oriented towards a critical account of the continental currency, rather than examine the important ideological continuities and practical adaptations between colonial and revolutionary eras and their approach to monetary questions. The focus has instead been on the chaos of the revolutionary era in terms of the continental currency. And I'm not sort of trying to suggest that it wasn't chaotic and that there wasn't sort of a ballooning of the emission of dollars or sort of precipitous depreciation. But there is a clear sense in which the politics of money, debt and credit came to be understood in very moral and theological terms, where the use of fiat currency issued as a collective debt was represented by the political elite as a kind of original sin, and that the claims of the political elite were made ex post facto in this respect, that the use of paper credit currency as the cornerstone of public credit for the Confederation was from the 1780s, sort of early 1780s onwards. So, people began to discuss it as a sort of morally bankrupt strategy which imperiled American public credit, and which sort of made it much more difficult for the American states to borrow. And so what I would instead argue is that if you look at the sort of record of how the continental currency was first talked about up until at least sort of 1780, when they decided to really stop issuing bills, it was actually really described in terms of a sort of managed bankruptcy, that it was the sort of language used was a sort of reflective of a sort of deliberate strategy, really, of using this currency to pay for the cost of war, even though it was acknowledged that there was going to be a lot of problems actually redeeming the currency, and that it would lose a lot of its value. So the terms in which the idea of the continental currency expressed itself were primarily the language of necessity, self-preservation and self-sufficiency. Functioning as a loan against future revenues, it was essentially a collective debt issued by Congress and the individual states, which would, in the words of Gouverneur Morris, act as a bond of union between the colonies. Called to defend the credit of the American states as it became increasingly apparent that it stood on tenuous foundations, both Franklin and John Adams defended a theory of money, the continental currency, as a public utility, even as the continentals began to sink in value. The continental currency issued by Congress had operated, in Adams' words, as an imperceptible tax. And integral to this argument was Franklin's claim that paper currency, although inflationary, involved a measure of equity in its circulation by its prevention of hoarding, since the longer it was held as individual property, the greater its depreciation. And so I quote Franklin here, "It will operate as a general tax on the colonies." So this is actually a quote from something that Franklin published and from, I think, the 1760s, but he uses the same sort of wording during the late 1770s. So it will operate as a general tax on the colonies, and yet not an unpleasing one. Perhaps more so than any other tax that can be invented, the rich who handle most money would in reality pay the most tax. So it's interesting to observe the ways in which this logic of sort of democracy and distribution in the circulation of the continental currency was carried over into Franklin and Adams' exchanges whilst they were diplomats in Europe over the depreciation of the continental currency. So Adams appealed to in his defences of the continental currency, he appealed to, quote, the rights of the public and the justice owed to the body politic, who, having entered into a covenant with Congress that the bills should pass as legal tender, could not claim depreciated bills should be repaid at anything beyond their nominal value. The bills gained their value through circulation as a socialised debt. Adams' point spoke to a larger set of issues in the political economy of public credit in the American Revolution, where the philosophy of money and its relationship to public credit continued to draw on a colonial theory of money, in which money functioned as a closed system, manageable and accountable to the community. The American Revolution effectively cashed in on the capacities of public credit, as originally theorized in early American political economy, where credit money was issued as a means of providing one aspect of the physical infrastructure of war, but also as a promise of the sort of commercial prosperity which could be achieved through independence from Britain. So in the post-revolutionary debate over the problem of public finance, one aspect usually neglected in favour of the debate over congressional powers to tax and regulate commerce was the problem or absence of a circulating currency. John Witherspoon's essay on money, published in 1787, was an important contribution to the debate over the theory of money and its implications for the political management of the money supply in the years immediately preceding the adoption of the Constitution. Arguments Witherspoon made in support of a specie-based theory of money and against the practices of fiat-based emissions by colonial legislatures drew on his Calvinism and common sense theory. Both were fundamental to the case for ending public control of monetary expansion through legislative initiative at the state level. The more immediate cause for publication was the financial crises which the United States were experiencing, a crisis which involved the first armed rebellion against federal authority, Shays' Rebellion of 1786. The rebellion began after the refusal of the Massachusetts legislature to grant tax and paper money relief. It was the widespread view of the political elite at the time that the rebellion was an indication of the intent of insurgents to abolish property through economic warfare, their chosen instrument of anarchy, paper money. With the colonial experience very much in mind, Witherspoon was most keen to disabuse American readers of the idea that it was possible to, quote, arm paper bills of credit with the authority of the state, for this was an absurdity and nothing less than an overturning of the natural order. It was this highly specious idea which, in Witherspoon's words, had been reserved for American legislatures who, by establishing nominal value by law, had extended their authority beyond its natural bounds. Tender laws were particularly pernicious and robbed property holders. In one memorable phrase, Witherspoon described the consequences of tender laws as a most ludicrous inversion of the nature of things, as creditors were caught running away from their debtors, pursuing them in triumph and paying them without mercy. His attack on the system of currency finance was made from the standpoint of affirming the mechanism by which money's value as a standard must always follow and accommodate itself to its value as a commodity. Most critics of the use of fiat paper currency to supplement the money supply attacked its proponents for confusing the nature of wealth with money and for misunderstanding the natural mechanism by which money gained its value. This meant that, quote, it must rise and fall in price according to the quantity that is brought to market, compared with the demand there is for it. So those are Witherspoon's words. More money brought into a country by increasing industry and profitable trade will mean not more money or a richer society, but rather a rise in the price of commodity and wages. The latter point has often been repeated in the critical responses to colonial monetary policies aimed at remedying the complaints about the scarcity of coin. It was always easy to castigate the colonial use of bills of public credit for misunderstanding the basic functions of money. Witherspoon described arguments on the scarcity of money as a, quote, radical error, supporting those absurd calls for an increase in the circulating medium to aid industry and to alleviate the distress caused by a want of coin. It was a category error to imagine that the circulating medium in a state equated to its wealth. The circulation of that, quote, indefinite quantity of precious metals made use of among the nations connected in commerce, end quote, was not owned by any particular nation, but found its level or circulation in any particular state, in keeping with the degree of industry and productivity appropriate to its population. The production of commodities, according to Witherspoon, must be the effect of industry and private interest. He referenced the work and ideas of David Hume in this respect. Industry was one of the cardinal virtues that Witherspoon sought to encourage and cultivate. His lectures on moral philosophy exhorted the popular virtues of industry, sobriety, frugality, and economy as essential to republican character and Christian morals. But it was clear from the essay on money that he saw the capacity for industry as undermined by the tendency for political corruption and a strategy for the appropriation of property by overly democratic legislatures. By the mid-1780s, Witherspoon's emphasis on industry was symptomatic of the increasing belief that the virtues of industry were being lost in favor of the expropriation of property from wealthier Americans. In the early 1780s, with an increasing emphasis placed upon the need for both national and privately chartered banks able to provide liquidity, public debate shifted towards a discussion of the kinds of institutional arrangements which could secure a paper bill's value. In Witherspoon's argument, paper credit currency, which acted only as a sign and not a standard of value, could not perform the functions of money. This claim was used to rule out fiat-based money, but it was not made with the intention of ruling out the use of paper currency issued by private banks or corporations using a fractional reserve system. In this situation, Witherspoon claimed that paper currency, while still producing negative effects, was useful, quote, in facilitating commerce both internal and external to the United States. Rather than carrying large amounts of coin, paper in the form of bills of credit or banknotes eased, quote, mercantile transactions. Equally, as Witherspoon observed, there are many people whose industry this is a quote again, there are many people whose industry is damped or limited by want of stock or credit, so that in extending credit or in anticipating real property, a paper circulation could provide a service to the individual and community. Yet the implication of this claim on the extension of private circulating credit was made with a view to its limited circulation, rather than to increase the sum of money in circulation. This cut against the notion which had dominated the colonial and revolutionary argument on monetary circulation, that its wide and egalitarian circulation was essential for the longevity of the body politic. For many, the direction of the argument on the distribution of property from the early 1780s favoured, in the words of Robert Morris, quote, distributing property into those hands which could render it most productive. So in the context of his claim that money had to function as a universal medium of commerce, Witherspoon was exactly right that fiat money issued by colonial legislatures and later by the Continental Congress had not been issued as an acceptable means of payment for foreign transactions. Instead, they were purely domestic obligations, often tenable only at the state level and largely consistent with the kind of strategies of self-sufficiency which made the political economy of the Revolution put forward as a solution to isolation from international trade. When Witherspoon reviewed the record of the use of fiat currency issued by the Continental Congress, he regarded it as a strategy of war, justified by the rights of necessity and the law of nations. In his review of the practices of colonial legislatures who had issued fiat money as part of the privileges of governance, he invoked Franklin's testimony to the British Board of Trade, that their operation had contributed to the growth and improvement of the colonies. Yet he regarded the success of these arrangements as a product of the land banks or loan office rather than the legislators themselves. Both Witherspoon and Benjamin Rush saw the call for the revival of loan offices as driven by the needs of land expansion and settlement, and therefore to some extent legitimate. This was the distinguishing feature of the American economy which made the debate over money and its terms of circulation fundamental. Rush considered the political economy of the loan offices issuing credit in the form of paper currency to be a relic of dependent colonies. Loan offices should be established, but only in issuing specie, for he considered paper currency to be a fatal cause of Americans' indebtedness to European powers. Rush inverted the basis of this system, arguing that it was only the ocean of private credit which could provide a fund large and stable enough to provide for farmers. Rush ruled out the issuing of paper currency, even supported by specie. The former system of public credit operating in the colonies before independence was based on short-term public debts, and he described it as the pap breast milk of feeble colonies. Yet, as Witherspoon and Rush had acknowledged, the colonial model of public credit had provided a means of channeling credit to those who could not otherwise obtain it privately for the purposes of the improvement of land and property. So I'm going over time. Can I just finish up the next couple of pages? Okay. So Hume is well known for having provided an analysis by which a nation's money supply would adjust in relation to its comparative level of output with other states with which it traded. In this respect, Witherspoon clearly concurred with Hume, using the idea of monetary flow in relationship to prices to reject American claims of monetary scarcity. Hume's essay of Money contained a suggestion of the providential nature or happy concurrence of causes in human affairs, which allowed poorer countries to still compete with richer ones due to the lower costs of labour. It was this fact which provided Hume with doubts over the benefit of banks and paper credit. For even as an increase of trade and money, he said, meant rising prices, it was better for a state to gradually adjust than to initiate monetary expansion, quote, increasing money beyond its natural proportion to labour and commodities. Hume was especially anxious that governments avoid using the tools of monetary expansion through public debt, since he saw this facility as containing no natural mechanism of limitation. For Witherspoon, it was providential, a matter of God's own creation, that all desired attributes of a monetary medium were found in precious metals. Witherspoon's strong condemnation of the issuing of paper currency by state governments was very much in keeping with Hume's injunctions on avoiding the politics of debt and monetary meddling. Following Hume, Witherspoon's essay provided an influential analysis of why the powers of money, debt and credit should be removed as a desideratum for governments. Witherspoon had analysed the problem of public trust at the domestic and international level as a consequence of the abuse of popular sovereignty by state legislatures in issuing paper money. The trust which was necessary for the operation of commercial conventions, like money, was incompatible with the powers of state assemblies, which might imperil property rights. Okay, so in conclusion, it was Madison who specifically, I should say that Madison was actually Witherspoon's student, It was Madison who specifically associated the policies of debtor relief laws, including paper money, as, quote, aggressions on the rights of other states, both domestic and foreign. He described the failure of moral imagination on the part of, quote, an ordinary citizen or even an assemblyman of Rhode Island in estimating the policy of paper money and what light the measure would be viewed in France or Holland or even in Massachusetts or Connecticut. Driven by pure and unenlightened self-interest, not even religion could restrain the impulse of debtors to defraud creditors. Only individuals of extended views and of national pride were able to understand the ramifications of the misuse of public credit. Drawing on Emir Vattel and those authors who put forward a view of public finance as part of a reformed modern commercial intercourse between nations, Madison viewed the removal of the powers to emit paper money as an essential condition for a stable union, and in this way he drew very much on Witherspoon's essay. In the eyes of the political elite, those who favoured constitutional reform, the Confederation's failures to provide for the repayment of the war debt were not merely failures of internal governance, but an inability to uphold those duties consistent with the law of nations, with civilised nations not apparently at war with each other. These were prerequisites, according to Madison, to commercial opportunity, as well as emblems of national honour, virtue and membership in the civilised world. As the conflict over the recovery of British private debts by hostile state legislators attested, the status of the law of nations for the conduct of foreign relations, including commerce, was ideologically imperative for the political elite.
Thank you to the four panelists for four fantastic papers. We're going to move over to questions, but just looking around, I want to say thank you to Chris again, because it's pretty humbling to be in the presence of this kind of group of people. I mean, it's really, it's a dream to have this kind of crowd for a panel on 18th century money, and Chris really deserves a lot of our thanks for putting all this together. So I just want to echo what the panelists said, and I'm just stunned and humbled by being in the presence of this audience. So over to you and questions. Yes, Mara.
Okay, so I have so we were asked in the last panel to consider the question of what kind of economy the financial system is meant to serve. I think that when we consider, especially, all of these contexts, but early American paper money as an example, these questions are really live in the contexts that we're looking at. So I have a question for Andrew that George might be able to comment on as well. But basically, it's a question about who really wanted this kind of money that was meant to self-destruct to revert to a sort of non-monetary wealth. It seems, I mean, you gestured to the idea that it was meant to serve as sort of planter merchant class, and I know that in all of these cases where colonial paper money was issued, and I know that your case focuses on continental currency, but I'm interested in some of its precursors. In all of these cases, there were really deep divisions in colonial society over what kind of economy people wanted to see, and there were really deep divisions that mirrored those over what money should look like, and whether it should be a permanent circulating currency or something temporary meant as a stopgap measure to deal with wartime debt and then to be sunk and burned, right? And so I see your story as just one side of that debate, and Pennsylvania is maybe an example where the other side wins out, where yes, those paper bills are sunk, but they're quickly replaced with even larger issues of more and more paper currency that's meant to serve sort of a large range of transactions over a long period of time for the population of the colony. So yeah, I guess I just am curious. Do you really see the approach to money that you've laid out as the American one, the sort of the temporary, the money to burn approach? Do you see that as a consensus, or is that I guess, yeah, I just wanted you to talk a little bit about those conflicts.
That's a really good question. So I've struggled with this when talking about paper money in the American context for a long time, because on a certain level, I think a lot of us who study early American money and who pay attention to early American money
like to see it as this sort of liberatory project. You know, it's a project of a bunch of people who got together and made their own money in the absence of the imperial money, which they didn't have, right? And that feels like something pretty good, but you have to realize on a very real level that this was the political economy of slavery. The people who put this together, and particularly the people who are advocating for that money being burned, right? So the money being temporary, were the people who owned the other forms of physical wealth which actually dominated colonial society. So slaves, land, mercantile capital. And to all of those, you know, all those people, some of them might want money, this, that, and the other, but in general, the notion of an existing like a moneyed capital, a money, you know, a permanent money, a permanent form, money as a permanent form of wealth, was going to destabilize their sort of place in colonial society. So yeah, it's a really important, I think, yeah, so that's the answer, and this is from Alice Hanson Jones. So you see sort of the distribution of wealth within the colonies and the tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of cash involved. So it's these people, the people who owned slaves and servants, the people who owned, you know, land, who owned these, you know, producer durables. Those are the people who this money was meant to serve, or who the burning specifically was meant to serve.
Right, and then just on the flip side of that, I think a lot of the people who wanted a permanent circulating currency were trying to start manufacturing industries and exchanges.
Yeah, over and over and over and over again that other people advocated for it. But I think part of the reason that at the end of the day they failed over the course of the colonial period anyway was because these interests won out.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a really important and essential point, and it's clearly the connection to slavery is really fundamental. But just to qualify it, I mean, to some extent, I think that there really is also a language of welfare in there too, and I think that's an important aspect because, you know, for so long for a long time we've associated, especially in the context of America, the sort of rise of finance as being really an elite project and one, I think, wedded to sort of like a fiscal military state. And I think that actually when you look at the certainly the intellectual history of money that I do, you see a really very different project at the heart of it too, and one that actually, as Jim was talking about, is Atlantic. That to look at it purely in the context of, I think the American colonies would be wrong. I think there's a circulation of ideas going on about the circulation of money, which is very much anti, in a sense, anti-hierarchy. I mean, and on the question of the sort of longevity of this money, I mean, you also see the attack made by people like William Douglas, and you've read his stuff on the history of the American colonies currency. He's really worried that the circulating paper credit currency is going to turn into a long-term public debt, right? That's what the reason he's actually really concerned about that is because he thinks that will mean that the American colonies have a larger claim to statehood, or have a claim to statehood rather, and that therefore could be a sort of a cause of a kind of revolutionary sentiment. So I think that there is that aspect too, that really it is seen as being a kind of expression of sovereignty to be able to issue money as debt, or be able to issue money at all. So you have those sort of, I think, those aspects which need to be thrown into the picture too.
Rebecca, that's fine.
Yeah, this was going to sound more like a comment than a question, but it builds so well off this, and I will come to a question as quickly as I can. So I'm really struck by George and Andrew's discussion of the continental credit currencies as necessary to get us through a crisis and perhaps to fulfill an important welfare function. And that idea that you create a money for a period of crisis is, of course, the way they talk about the assignats, right? The assignats are the savior of France. And there were also public burnings of assignats, right? They are meant to be revolutionary, and the revolution isn't supposed to go on forever. Right? We're going to get to the end of this, and then we'll have some sort of stability. So then I was also thinking about Chris's initial discussion about the greenbacks, which also exist for a specific period of time to fulfill a certain purpose. And I was thinking in all three of those cases, how our picture of them as irresponsible, chaotic, disastrous are stories written in retrospect by creditors, which reminded me very much of Julian Hoppett's excellent article on Myths of the South Sea Company, where really not that many people are ruined, but a few really angry people produce this story about it being a ridiculous bubble. So then, this is where we get to the question, and it's relevant because this is the Empire panel. I was also thinking about Michael O'Malley's book, Face Value, in which he talks about the creditor reaction against the greenbacks, the gold bugs, who say something has intrinsic value. The proponents of the idea of gold having intrinsic value were also the political voices after the Civil War that opposed Reconstruction and said that people have intrinsic value, and it's chiefly white people who have lots of intrinsic value, and some other people who don't really have very much at all. So that this idea of intrinsic value is, at least in the aftermath of the American Civil War, a racist idea. And so I was wondering about the sort of racial politics of all of these short-term monies and whether we can sort of read that analysis, which is from a very specific point in American history, back and think about it in an 18th century context, or if the issues around race are just so different it's not going to apply the same way.
Shall I go first?
Go, feel free.
Yeah.
Be happy.
Yeah, I mean, so I think your point on the sort of the way in which currency is looked at retrospectively, the history of currency, is really important. It's sort of what I was trying to say in the paper, but it was a bit garbled because I was running out of time. Or maybe it's just garbled, I don't know. I think that really is one of the crucial points here is that the way that the history, I mean, as I was writing my dissertation on public credit in the American colonies in the 18th century, I realized that I really should actually be writing a dissertation on the histories of the currency, because that's really fascinating. And so I think that has the sort of retrospective judgment, which was very much came from a very interested place, has a lot to say about how we understand the history of currencies at this time. On the question of race and ethnicity, I think this is again, I mean, Franklin is a really good example here of that, because he's the most important theorist really of colonial and revolutionary currency. His desire to see the expansion of the money supply was very much to do with wanting to enable the expansion of land and settlement in the colonies. He has a really interesting idea of a fiscal union between the colonies and the mother country. He writes in the 1760s, and it's very much from a racial place, is that he wants to discourage a certain kind of landed settlement by a certain kind of people. He does want to discourage slavery, and he really wants a sort of British Anglo-Saxon types to come to America, use the paper money to buy tools, buy land, and to improve it and expand the frontier, basically. So from that point of view, it sort of fits into his understanding of demographics and political economy very much, yeah.
I mean, that's a really fantastic question. And that's a really interesting book, O'Malley's book. I think that, I mean, the way I thought about the colonial period to a significant degree is that it's a society that doesn't have very much money, doesn't have many financial instruments. And one way you can read that economy is that when you don't have finance, you invest in people. And because the thing that really matters is the ability to command labor sort of within that society. So that can mean investing in slaves, it can mean buying slaves, buying people in order to move them around. It can also mean, investing in putting debts on your neighbors, like, a merchant and a northern seaport might do that. Right? So they would build out these vast networks of people who owed them so that they could command the goods that they were going to need to sort of deal in Atlantic trade. And I think that when you get into the 19th century, you can see a very similar dynamic happening, in the American South, in the sense that these people who are very much invested in unfree labor are simultaneously sort of necessarily invested in an economy that does not privilege the monetary wealth that's being produced by northern banks in the same period. And they attempt to eliminate it over and over and over again throughout the antebellum period. I think that's sort of the dynamic that you see playing out in a post-Civil War context in O'Malley's book.
Can I just add one thing that I forgot to say? Also, I mean, we shouldn't forget the fact that a lot of this colonial paper money is being used to fight wars against Native Americans. So, I mean, that's another aspect of it.
Can I just actually extend this question slightly to Elizabeth? I was wondering how the abolition of slavery plays into the background of the East India Company scandal that you talked about, and also whether there is another dimension about minorities that plays through the suspicion of speculation being linked to foreign agents. Is this an anti-Semitic trope at the time? In what ways is it linked to foreigners?
It's unquestionably a xenophobic trope. I wouldn't say that it was specifically either anti-Semitic or driven by racism. It was xenophobic in that they were mainly concerned about British agents, Dutch agents, Austrian agents, Prussian agents. It never really plays into any of the kind of stereotypes that you're describing. The relationship of the abolition of slavery to the East India economy in the 1790s is kind of a difficult question, actually, because at this point, the East India Company, the Compagnie des Indes, does not have specific investments in the Atlantic economy. They do not control the Atlantic or Caribbean colonies the way they did in the earlier part of the 18th century. So the two worlds, in many ways, are more disentangled than they ever had been before. That said, I think we might be able to think about the moment of 1793 being, in some ways, a very anti-colonial moment, precisely because the Haitian Revolution is underway in the Atlantic world. And there is this deep-rooted skepticism in Jacobin politics of commercial interest in general as potentially entangled with these foreign agents and whatnot, bringing counter-revolutionary forces into France. And I think that's where the connection is. It's on more of an ideological level than a specifically financial one.
Did you have a question specifically on this?
Yes.
Okay, why don't we take yours first and then we go to Bob Pocket afterwards.
Speaking of currency being outside of just monetary money and getting into flesh currency, I am interested in how that worked within. I mean, I know people during the revolution and everything like that, it was difficult to have monetary. And I'm just interested in how did flesh currency work? Like, how were people able to really trade flesh and make it work as money in America, in Great Britain, or whatnot? Because I know the slavery is just talked about as like my people were picking cotton or whatever, but I just am interested in how that became, how my ancestors' flesh became currency. How did it make wealth? And if you can give me any readings, any books that I can look up to find out more. So, and this is for everybody. Because I'm interested in the Haitian Revolution. I'm half Haitian, half Mississippi. So that's fine. Thank you.
I mean, there's a vast literature, but we can take it off. Huh? Oh, gosh. I'm not really sure where to start.
It's a bit like being in our general exam again.
Yeah, exactly.
A good survey book on the Haitian Revolution is Avengers of the New World by Laurent Dubois. That would be sort of a basic primer on the mechanics of the slave economy and then what happened throughout the revolution.
But on the fiscalization, financialization of race, that collective volume that's vended on slavery and capitalism.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Some really good articles.
Yeah, Slavery's Capitalism, edited by Sven Beckert. Yeah.
Okay, let's move.
The other guy, there's a very easy answer to this question that you all should give, right? Which is simply that as bodies with prices, enslaved people served as the basis of a credit system.
Yeah.
That's right.
In an economy in which everyone is borrowing, what you do to secure that debt is not necessarily to explicitly collateralize enslaved people, but to know that you can always call the sheriff to put a person up on the block and get your money that way. And that's the basis of slaves becoming money.
But that is exactly right. And that's one of the reasons that the issuance of paper money starts to be an emancipatory project for a lot of people. So people like Tucker argue that in as much as the capital of the North Atlantic is embedded in people, right, it is necessarily dominatory, and thus public credit drives war, empire, and slavery. In as much as you issue a currency, no matter how you do it, you thus create the possibility of internal development projects which are not so dependent on external trade in order for the nation to survive, and it therefore means that you're not committed to slavery, war, and empire. So those two things cross one another.
Okay, Bob Pocket.
Great. So I wanted to know what appears to be a practice that has a certain parallel to money burning, and then pose a question in connection with that apparent parallel. So the parallel is this: it apparently used to be something of an institution in American society to hold a mortgage burning party once you had paid off your mortgage on your home. Right? I don't know exactly when this died out. It seems to have been sometime around the 1950s or 1960s, but apparently it's quite powerfully practiced. Right? And of course, the parallel to burning celebrated it by burning the artifact, the symbol of that obligation, basically signifying your freedom, right? Now, so here's the question, and that seems to me to suggest then that any kind of debt instrument, circulating or otherwise, is viewed as a problem, right? Something that you don't want to have to be subject to, and that suggests a certain kind of individualism, I suppose, or a kind of an anti-solidaristic way of thinking from one point of view, and that is that if you think about it, solidaristic thinking is thinking pursuant to which we all are in a sort of obligated to one another, right? That one doesn't view one's being obligated as a source of impoverishment or as something that's sort of unpleasant. One actually celebrates the fact that one might be obligated to others, at least provided that there's some symmetry when it comes to sort of inter-obligatedness among people who constitute a society. And so I guess I'm wondering then if the practice of currency burning might be viewed as having kind of gone hand in glove with a kind of libertarianish way of thinking or a kind of individualistic way of thinking that was in a way anti-solidaristic because it was anti-obligatedness.
That's of course the exact argument that Alexander Hamilton made regarding the national debt, you know, that it was going to bind people together. And many people made that argument over the course of the period. That's actually exactly the point that I was trying to make, and actually that Mara raised, that in a sense burning the money was a way of, you know, getting rid of the bond that the money represented. And I actually argued in the paper that I thought of Americans' colonial currencies as sort of a mortgage voucher, in the sense that when you paid them off, all you didn't get it, when you paid them in taxes, the state didn't get anything, you didn't get anything, except for the fact that all of the property that could conceivably be, you know, sold if you didn't pay those taxes, that lien upon that property was removed. So you were suddenly disobligated to the community. So I think that's really interesting.
And it's potentially disturbing, right? It's sort of like everybody throwing away their wedding rings or something.
I mean, I think I would dispute the extent to which they. I think there is a solidaristic. I think there really is a solidaristic argument, actually. I mean, if you read like Cotton Mather, for example, you know, he writes an essay on paper currency where he's saying, you know, we're not followers of Hobbes. We like really actually do believe that. I mean, it's a Christian claim that we really do believe that we should love each other, and that this paper currency circulates because of that, right? And that claim continues to get made throughout the course of the 18th century up until the American Revolution. It's one of the reasons that the French think the continental currency was such a success, because it actually did bind citizens of the Union together, and it did actually act as a sort of proto sort of nationalism in some respect. Not that I'm saying nationalism is a good thing, but it's certainly in the context of the American Revolution, that's the way, one of the ways in which the continental currency is theorized. So I think that it's paradoxical, or at least contradictory, in the sense that it's both solidaristic and anti-solidaristic. It's a Republican versus liberal debate, in a sense, going on, you know.
No, I very much agree. I mean, those two impulses are very much in contradiction, just built in actually into the institution itself.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems far removed from us, but finance comes from the French finir, right? Something that ends. Exactly. Rowan Gray.
Yeah, thanks. This was a fascinating panel, and I'm really loving the metaphorical exploration of burning and its historical role. I'm curious to compare that what you were talking about in the United Kingdom. You were sort of talking about money enduring there, and obviously at some physical property level of certain instruments, there might be a level of enduring. I'm curious if you think about that at the conceptual kind of budgetary layer. If we think about today, for example, where almost much money is virtual. The Treasury still has a general account that has a positive value that gets topped up, but if it doesn't get topped up and there needs to be borrowing and securities get issuance, etc. But that whole process still effectively involves deleting sort of tax money on one side and issuing new money on the other. And if there's an imbalance, we do this complicated public debt stuff. But those two functions don't have a direct relationship to each other. So I'm curious in the UK, is it primarily about the endurance of the physical instruments? Is it something about the way that idea affects budget policy more generally, or is that really a fiction where there's a sort of destruction and a creation, but the narrative links them in a way that's symbolically different to the burning, where the burning is sort of every time we wipe the slate clean and therefore we're coming back to the table, whereas this has a continuity of some pre-existing political commitment that isn't necessarily grafted one-to-one with the physical aspect of the endurance. So I was just trying to separate out the endurance of the concept of the capital stock or the debt stock from the endurance of
the physical thing. I mean, I think it's an ideological notion that money is enduring more than anything else. What you're describing about the current UK version of creating money and destroying money, I think has a lot more in common in a sense with the American version, except for the fact that it's constantly rolling. And the American version.
Example,
Yeah, the Pennsylvania example is much better. In a sense, like the American monies were designed to end, period, full stop, at some point. Of course, they never really did, but they were designed to sort of work that way. While the British monies, I mean, the interesting thing, it's very striking to me that they thought of, the money pre-existing outside of the state, coming into the state, going back outside of the state, but the same money continues over time. And that's very, very, very different, I think, from what the Americans were doing. It'd be really interesting to track how that transformed into their current fiscal policies, but.
A question from over there. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Yeah, Karen, by the way, social studies program at Hamilton. I just wanted to get, I haven't formulated this quite into a question yet, but I kind of want to see. I think the reason that mortgage is not solidaristic but anti-solidaristic is because of, I think, of the expression of mortgaging one's future. So mortgages may tie you to other people in society through debt, but they break your tie to your heirs because they take your inheritance away and they break the transfer of money. And so, why is that significant here? I mean, I think first it raises the significance of the family as a particular community. I think in terms of citizen versus state, that the family is a irrevocable body. But the way that I want to ask the question to you guys is about the issue that raises as money is establishing a relationship in time. And I think in a moment of revolution, that's particularly important, right? The ability of money to establish a relationship, or credit and debt, to establish a relationship with the future. And the extent to which I guess that may raise particular anxiety about monetary regimes in revolution. Again, I don't have this is sort of just opening up with respect to the conversation. I haven't framed it up as a full question, so I wonder if maybe that's something you would want to comment on, thinking about that relationship of time, how that would fit into this story about regimes of money and revolutions in particular moment of the 18th century as being one in particular of an responsibility, but also a real anxiety.
Oh, but maybe the French side has something to say about time.
Well, I'll go back, and then possibly go further. I mean, if you think about the Great Inflation, so the influx of silver into Europe in the 16th and 17th century, which provokes inflation, which goes beyond that silver account. So, when we get the creation of these funny money instruments, it precisely is that there are activities that we literally don't have the money to represent, right? And the circulation of money, the velocity of the relationship of money isn't going quickly enough. Now, the entire point of the late 18th century revolutions was supposed to be the extirpation of poverty, and that was conceptualized as finding finding a solution to the collective action problems through which individuals who had needs and others who had means to satisfy those needs could link up with one another. They were supposed to be redescribed as rights, right? That's the August 1789 thing. So you redescribe everybody's property as rights. That makes them calculable and communicable one to the other. Thus, a natural equilibrium will emerge, which will be represented by money, and that's why the assignat's supposed to work. That the assignat just sits on top of a rights regime as an almost transparent instantiation of what the future achieved value, which is latently there. So the anxiety you speak about, of course, occurs when that doesn't happen. If you have a whole series of expectations that if we simply did away with the impediments to understanding value as rights, that if that triangle, rights, property, value was put in place, then the system would naturally stabilize itself. Then what? That's when I think these kinds of stories then, because then somebody must be doing something wrong at that point.
Yeah, I mean, it shows how much financial choices are linked to some sort of political prediction of a certain kind of future. So in 1793, if you have all of your money in East India Company stock rather than in assignats or in biens nationaux, it's assumed that that means some sort of, you're forecasting a political failure, effectively, of the revolution of the Republic. And you're instead forecasting the commercial rise of certain private bodies in comparison. So I think that's sort of the transition in time that you're talking about, this idea that every financial choice involves your own forecast in some ways. And if you're making the wrong forecast, at least by the state's conception, that's really problematic.
I don't really care that much about money. I'm thinking how I should understand what you're saying. Should it be about nation building? Should it be about individualism? Or should it be about some concept that would bring both of these ideas together?
The
Big one.
Well, the fundamental unit you're asking there is what's the unit the unit of which the society is, right? And what I would suggest is that nation is conceptualized as the response to the problem of empire. So nation is not ethnicized or any of that stuff. It's that if we had a naturally occurring political unit, which would be a nation, which is a group of persons living under the common law who solve one another's economic problems, who meet one another's needs, right? That's the alternative empire, which, while a lovely idea, has turned out to be nothing other than looting, robbing, and enslaving people, right? I suppose one of the, is when you get into the French side of it, what you're looking at is then at a universe of creative failure, right? That the nation's a brilliant idea, conceptualized in that fashion, but it turns out that when you create nations, you get 15 years of European war, which have been worse than any other war that you've had in the 18th century. So there's this constant frustration of anticipated outcome. Oh, we've nations, therefore we will now be at peace. Get Anacharsis Cloots and his mates wandering around, right? And actually what we're going to do is save everybody's people against their fearful oppressors by invading them all.
Well, and it also just shows how the process of creating a nation state within an imperial framework is really problematic, right? Because you have all of these strange transnational institutions that were created for the purpose of a global empire that suddenly no longer fit within the dominant discourse of the nation state. And that's where you start having these kinds of contestations about who owns what and if it's legitimate.
And I mean, as a matter of history, over the 19th century in the United States, people are arguing back and forth constantly over what the notion of money is meant to be for. Is it meant to serve the people? Is it meant to serve a Midwestern grain farmer? Is it meant to serve a New York banker? Is it meant to serve this broader notion of a global free market? What is it for? So this is, I mean, it's an inherently political problem that you raise.
Can I just ask you, James, to extend what you said a moment ago into the other direction towards the provinces? So if this is a panel about empire, it means, you know, in the 18th century, this is not an age of nation states, but these are imperial projects. But in some way, what James's paper does is flip it around and says that also means internally, provinces are much more important than we kind of think initially. So how does this play out? And I'm asking this partially because I'm personally very interested in B.R. Ambedkar, the Indian monetary thinker and constitutionalist, whose two kind of singular obsessions early in his life are Indian regional finances and the problem of the rupee, which for him are intrinsically linked.
And I would extend and I'd say that if you flip it forward again, the problem of the euro is this problem, right? Where you have, if you're investing in the euro and you're buying it through Athens, you're paying a completely different price to what if you're buying it through Berlin, right? So we've recreated in wonderful ways this problem of a differentiated but universal currency. Yeah? I think it's the problem of the province is precisely the nation emerges as a solution to the problem of the province when no one can find another solution. This is most obvious in Irish history, right? So after the Americans declare independence, the British state clearly understands that if it continues to act in the same way toward its colonial dependencies, it will simply fracture. So Ireland is given free trade in 1779 and legislative independence in 1782. So thus it is a province, it's a part of the empire with really established legal legal right to act independently, its right to free trade. And then in 1785, they tried to do a free trade treaty between Britain and Ireland as independent kingdoms within an imperial structure. And it can't be done, right? Because the problem of sovereignty in an imperial structure keeps re-emerging, that ultimately some entity is going to have to be the final call. And until you've done something like the Holy Roman Empire, right, where you have truly distributed sovereignty, that problem of the sovereign ability to decide keeps smashing up the provincial structures.
Okay, I realized we actually wildly ran over time because I was so excited. So I apologize for holding you here. And thank you to the 4 fantastic panelists again.